like to welcome everybody here tonight for our lecture. Thanks for coming. We're excited to hear Joby's story. But before I get into the introduction, I wanted to just let you all know that I am, for those of you who do not know me, I'm Adrienne Northington, and I am filling in as Executive Director of the Foundation of Wayne Community College. We sponsor all of these lectures. And so we have a new Executive Director, and her name is Jacqueline Cannon. She's right here. So we welcome you, Jacqueline, and she's got a learning curve to learn, but we'll get there. So anyway, it's my pleasure tonight to introduce and welcome back tonight's speaker, Joby Warrick, a native of Wayne County and a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner and author of 4 nonfiction books. Joby was a speaker for our Arts and Humanities program back in 2017 and spoke about his 2016 Pulitzer Prize book, Black Flags, a narrative account of the personalities and events which gave rise to ISIS. Joby served for nearly 3 decades as a national security reporter for the Washington Post, covering the Middle East and terrorism and reporting from scores of cities from around the world. He has been working on his latest book, which is a retelling of the story of international super terrorist Carlos the Jackal, which will be published this spring. But tonight, Joby will be talking to us about World War I and the young men from Wayne County who were called to serve their country in the trenches of France in this long, bloody war. One of those men who answered the call was Joby's great uncle. Joby took on the challenge to retrace his uncle's experience in World War I. Many families back home knew little about the experiences of the North Carolina soldiers who fought in the Great War. With words and photos, Joby will present us with an astonishing tale of heroism by veterans who were part of every major U.S. engagement of the war. Joby's research led to some surprising discoveries about the sacrifices of young men who fought and died over a century ago, as well as the impact on their families back home. So, without further ado, Joby, come on up and tell us the story.
Hello, hello. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Adrienne, for that great introduction. Thank you for all coming on a Monday night. And I have to say, it's great to be back here in Wayne County. This is where I was born many, many, many years ago, but it's great to see some very familiar faces. Adrienne mentioned I've worked in some pretty sketchy places throughout my career. I've been in war zones. I've interviewed terrorists. But I have to tell you, there's nothing that's more frightening than giving a talk in front of a bunch of your own relatives. So I think the village of Grantham is well represented. Are there any Grantham people? Can I see your hands? Wow. Anybody related to the Stevens or Warrick families by marriage or birth? Could I see a hand? Okay, that's a lot. Well, I have to thank you guys especially, particularly the ones from the family, because this is your story too, and I've just had, I think, a special privilege to be able to talk about it in front of other people and to tell the story to a larger audience. I have to say a special thank you to a couple of people here, particularly Adrienne, Charlotte, Wendy, Jacqueline, Caleb, everybody from the WCC Foundation who invited me here, faculty administration who hosted me today, and I had a wonderful time talking to some of your great students and really enjoyed that. And I also have to thank a couple of organizations. There have been many that contributed to my research, but I want to mention in particular the Wayne County Historical Association and the Wayne County Veterans Memorial, 2 organizations that are very worthy of your support. So again, thank you for coming, and I'm going to get right to this so we can have some time to talk at the end. And I'm going to get my pointer out because my starting point is a portrait and a question. Here's the portrait. The question is this. If I went to your house today, would I find a picture or a portrait like this of a man or a woman in uniform? Someone who served this country either recently or a long time ago. Maybe the picture's on a wall someplace. Maybe it's in a scrapbook. If I came there tonight, would I find a photo like that? If you have one, would you raise your hand? That's almost everybody. Would you keep your hand up if you served in the armed forces yourself? This is Wayne County. It's always a lot of people. Well, thank you for your service. We got Veterans Day coming up very soon, as you know. So this is the portrait that is in my house now. And for years before that, it was displayed in my grandmother's house because it's my grandmother's brother. His name was Foster Stevens. And here's an inscription that was on the portrait. I hope you can read it. It sums up the bulk of the information we had about this veteran. We knew that the portrait was a source of family pride and also emblematic of some sacrifice, of generational pain and grief. And we also knew the exact date of my great-uncle's death. This is how it was listed in the official War Department notice. Now let's reflect, I hope you can all see that, on this date. Today is November 3rd. So this sacrifice, this Marine's death, took place exactly 107 years ago yesterday. And there's also an interesting fact, if you look closely. The date of the death is November 2nd. The end of the war was November 11th, if you know your World War I history. So this was a combat death that occurred 9 days before the war was officially over. So what happened to this young Marine? Where did he serve? What did he do? How did it come about that he was killed when he was almost ready to come home? Now, these are the questions that created an aura of mystery around this portrait for me as a kid. And the mystery followed me throughout my adulthood for reasons I'll explain. And eventually it becomes a fascination and then an obsession, and it leads to a month of research and trips to archives and museums, a trip overseas to Europe, and eventually to a two-part series that was published in the Washington Post. In the next few minutes, I'm going to take you on a portrait, or excuse me, take you on a journey of discovery from me, and how I came to develop the story, and I hope it's a journey of discovery for you. And along the way, we're going to hear 4 different stories. We're going to hear a very personal family story about loss and sacrifice. There's a story of Wayne County at war. The Great War was on the other side of the planet, and we don't often think about it these days. But it had a profound impact here on the home front, and it changed us in our world in surprising ways. These are all Wayne County young men that were killed in the First World War. This is also a story about men at war, and some women too. So we're going to follow them overseas and into combat, and you'll hear what it was like in their own voices. And the climax is a battle you may have never heard of before, but it happened to have been the biggest single engagement of U.S. forces in history, bigger than Gettysburg, bigger than D-Day. The fighting turned out to be decisive in terms of the outcome of the war and also in terms of cost, the number of lives lost. How costly was it? I'll give you one statistic. On one day of this battle, remember it happened for weeks in 1918, on one day, 251 North Carolina soldiers were killed in combat. On one day, 251 soldiers. We'll talk about that today. And finally, you're going to be able to witness with me how we resolved the central mystery of what happened to this one Wayne County Marine. The answers come in a dramatic and unexpected way, literally from a voice from the grave, a voice that emerges a century after the events and bringing definitive answers and a clarity that's both comforting and painful to this Marine's family. But my hope tonight is not just to tell stories, but also to cause you to reflect on the service members and those portraits in your house. I hope it creates a moment for you to reconnect with those veterans and their stories, and even if you don't know a veteran, it gives you a way to reconnect with our collective story as people from this community. So why this particular journey? Well, let me start with a family introduction. As I said, as a kid, Foster Stevens was this portrait. It was a Marine veteran frozen in time. But of course, he was not always such. Foster Stevens was also a son and a brother, a boy who grew up in the Grantham community in the southwest part of the county. It was a big family. His dad was a cotton farmer, that's him with a mustache. His mother, Mary Alice Grantham Stevens, over there on the right, raised 10 children. So 3 boys, 6 girls here, 1 more girl on the way. And the young man on the upper left, as you're facing the screen, that's Foster Stevens as a young man, probably about 18, we think. And this lovely little girl below him is very special to the story, and that's Ina Stevens. That's my grandmother. Fast forward to Ina as a young woman. The loss of her brother when she was a teenager affected her profoundly, and she grieved for him for the rest of her life. Decades after the war, it remained a painful memory for her. I tried to describe how it was for her in the first opening lines of the 2 articles I wrote. Ina, who was 17 when her older brother was killed, could rarely bring herself to talk about it. Once after one of the marathon Scrabble games she played night after dinner, she spoke wistfully about the day Foster left home for the war, boarding a horse-drawn wagon that would carry him the 13 miles to the train station in Goldsboro. I cried, he cried, we all cried, she said. About his death, she said, it was a sad, sad day, a sad, sad day. And she said nothing more. Now, the Ina Stevens we knew was a force of nature, possessed of what the article calls an imperturbable cheerfulness. She married a country doctor, Joby Warrick, who set up a practice in Grantham and delivered probably half the babies in southwestern Wayne County during that time. She had 4 children, and she was widowed at age 60. And after her husband's death, she went on to run blood drives for the American Red Cross, and she was a loving matriarch of a very big family and the pillar of our community and church for another 40 years. Her lasting tribute to her brother was that portrait that she kept on the wall in the living room. On patriotic holidays, on the 4th of July, she would put little flags on the portrait. Her love for her brother so impressed me that when I was a college student spending a semester in Europe, I decided I would try to find the grave. It was at a cemetery somewhere in Europe. My grandmother had never seen it, so I grabbed a friend and we went off hitchhiking. First, we managed to go to the wrong cemetery. I remembered hearing my grandmother talk about a place called Flanders Fields, this American graveyard. There was a poem associated with it. And so first we went there and whoops, wrong cemetery, wrong country. So it turns out this was in Belgium. I finally did my research and we figured out the grave was actually at this place. This is the American cemetery at Mousargan. It's by far the biggest U.S. military cemetery in Europe, with 14,000 war dead. Most of them were killed in that one massive battle that I talked about, the Mousargan offensive. I found the grave, despite having the handicap of this big mop of black hair. And I took some photographs, and I made a scrapbook for my grandmother and gave it to her when I got home. Giving her those photos was a very emotional moment for the 2 of us, and there were some tears shed. And years later, when we finally lost my grandmother, she left instructions that the portrait of Foster would be left for me. I saw it as her way to say thank you. And so that's how the portrait ended up in my office at my house. And for almost 20 years, it was a daily reminder of my grandmother and her brother and the love that still continued to burn bright for so many years. But the questions I had as a kid were never answered. So skip ahead to 2018, suddenly there's a lot of interest in World War I because of the 100th anniversary of the armistice, and that becomes an excuse for finally doing the research I'd wanted to do to try to rewind the clock and see if some answers still existed in records someplace that might fill in the gaps in our knowledge. Now, if you've done any work on veterans or any research in this area, you know there's quite a lot of material if you know where to look for it. In archives in Washington, D.C., in St. Louis, there are boxes and boxes of original material, regimental records, after-action reports, hand-drawn maps like this, notes scribbled by men who were still in the trenches when they wrote them, diaries and oral histories. So I had a great time just immersing myself in all this material. And if you're lucky, you can actually find personnel records for individual servicemen. You can find death records that describe, in some cases, how the person was killed and what happened to the remains. And I was eventually able to pinpoint exactly where in France my uncle had fought in the last days of his life and what his unit was doing at the time. So I traveled to France to retrace his steps to the same village where he had walked. And I also immersed myself in Foster's time, trying to understand what his life was like before the war. So let's teleport ourselves back to Wayne County in 1917. It looks very different than it does now, as you can imagine. The town of Goldsboro had 6,000 people. That's about the size of Mount Olive. The entire county had 40,000 people. That's about a third of what it is now. And most of those people didn't live in town, they lived in the countryside. This is a bridge over the Falling Creek near the Neuse River, just about a mile from Stevens' house. And here, or anywhere outside Goldsboro, you would find almost no paved roads. There's no electricity. There's no running water. There's no television. Radio hadn't come around yet. Goldsboro had a couple of newspapers which provided the only regular link to the outside world if you could read. The compulsory education was just a few years old at that time, so about 12% of the population of the county could not read or write. Now, Wayne County also had experienced war firsthand, and not that long ago. In 1917, there were people who still vividly remembered the Civil War. Foster's grandfather, Josiah Stevens, had fought in that war. Sherman's army, after destroying Atlanta, marched through Wayne County on the way to Goldsboro to take over the railroad junction there. The Yankees and Confederates fought a big battle just across the county line in Bentonville, just 10 miles from the Stevens farm. Now consider for a moment the proximity in time, and I love to do this. From the start of from the start of the Civil War, get this right, from the Civil War to the start of the First World War is 50 years. I finally got it. So that means 50 years since Sherman's troops occupied streets in Goldsboro. That's the distance in time from the First World War to the Civil War. For comparison, that's the amount of time from our generation, from our time, to Vietnam. I know there are a lot of people in this auditorium that remember Vietnam very well or know people who served in that war. So that's the interval we're talking about. So people in Foster's generation could personally recall a time when North Carolina was officially at war with the United States. And now their sons were being drafted into the U.S. Army to fight a massive war in Europe. Now, this was not a war that many Americans were initially eager to get into. Despite slogans about this being a war to make the world safe for democracy, in reality it was about competition between great European powers and their many tangled alliances. At least that's how it started. This was not a war about ideals. Americans stayed away from the war for the first 3 years while the Allies and the Central Powers slaughtered each other in the trenches. The war ended up killing 10 million soldiers alone and at least that many civilians. Germany and France lost about 4% of their entire population. For comparison, if we had the same kind of losses here in the United States today, that would be 14 million people, so more than the entire state of North Carolina. Now, both sides tried to manipulate public opinion in the United States either to draw us into the war or to keep us out. But eventually, in April 1917, President Wilson declares war and joins the fight on the side of the Western Allies. And we jump in a very big way. U.S. deployments overseas seem ordinary now. We've had the Vietnam War and Korea and Iraq and Afghanistan. But in 1917, we had never sent massive numbers of troops overseas to fight. There was the Spanish-American War, some minor excursions, but nothing like this. This was unprecedented in our history. And people from this area responded to the call. Thousands of young men from Wayne County ended up being drafted or volunteering, mostly for the Army, but some for the Navy. Many were white, many were African Americans who were also called up for service. Some joined local units like the Goldsboro Rifles, the 119th Infantry Division, which is descended from local militias in the Civil War. I have to say, you can see those induction rolls now if you go back, and you can see your families, typically people from your family who were listed on the induction rolls to fight in World War I. When I looked through, I didn't see Foster's name because he volunteered later. I did find a surprising name of Joby Warrick, my grandfather, had been inducted to serve in the First World War, apparently because he was in college at the time and studying to go to medical school. He wasn't actually drafted, but he was called up. Now, Foster did not enlist until February 1918, so nearly a year after America had joined the war. He was the youngest son of a cotton farmer. He had two older brothers, and so I can imagine he was looking for a way to distinguish himself, maybe to have an adventure and see the world. We don't really know his motivation. We do know he did something unusual. He joined the Marine Corps as a volunteer. Now, the Marine Corps is not the military juggernaut that we think of today. Back in 1917, or at the start of the war, there were only 13,000 enlisted personnel in the entire Marine Corps. It's quite tiny. By the end of the war, there were 70,000 Marines, and that's still only about half the size of the Marine Corps as we know it today. Foster shipped out. He went to Norfolk to join up, had his basic training, and then he got onto this ship, the USS Henderson, and in May of 1918, he arrived in France and was mustered into a unit of replacement soldiers. and he's assigned to an outfit called the 83rd Company, 3rd Battalion, 6th Marine Regiment. The numbers are always confusing. 83rd Company, 3rd Battalion, 6th Marine Regiment. And that's important because the 6th Regiment ends up becoming one of the most storied regiments in Marine history. And its legendary status was largely due to a battle that would take place very soon after Foster arrived in France. Now let's pause for a minute and think about the state of U.S. armed forces going into the war. Now, as I said, in 1917, the two sides in World War I had been fighting for nearly 3 years, and they had reinvented warfare and engineered all kinds of efficient ways to kill people on an industrial scale. World War I saw the invention of warplanes for the first time, tanks, chemical weapons, submarine warfare in the modern sense, trench warfare on a vaster, larger scale than ever been seen. And the U.S. military was not prepared for any of this. During my research, I talked to preeminent American historians about this moment, and this is what they told me. By every measure, the arriving Americans were ill prepared for the kind of grinding, heavily mechanized war of attrition that Europe's great armies had fought over the previous 3 years. The U.S. military had no tanks, had 0 airplanes. Its generals were slow to master the essential lessons of surviving as an army in the trenches. The prevailing view in the upper ranks was that the American fighting man was innately superior somehow. His character, his marksmanship, his maneuvers, all that was just better than what the Europeans could possibly do, and there was nothing the Europeans could teach them. Well, whatever the native talents, no matter how brave, no matter how good we were, these newcomers failed to grasp the rules of 20th century warfare, and that resulted in one of the steepest learning curves in modern military history, as one military officer told me. The Germans, the British, and the French get to learn from each other painfully over the war's early years. We were literally thrown into the deep end. And this fact, more than any other, would define the war's early months for Foster and other American doughboys. Many of them witnessed carnage on a scale that evoked comparisons to the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. Men were shoved in, and men continued to be killed. And one who witnessed this killing was Foster Stevens, who, as I discovered in my research, wound up again and again in the middle of some of the most memorable and often bloodiest American battles of all of World War I. One such battle took place in a square-mile patch of German terrain near the Marne River that's known to history as the Belleau Wood. On June 6, 1918, 2 battalions of Marines were ordered to charge across a wheat field to attack a heavily defended German line on the edge of the forest. As the Marines began their charge, the German machine guns cut down the Americans by the hundreds as they advanced through waist-high wheat without any cover. One Marine battalion, it happened to be that 3rd Battalion, 6th Regiment, made it all the way to the woods, and they secured a foothold and then drove the Germans back in hand-to-hand combat. A ferocious counterattack followed, but the Marines held their ground. It was the 3rd Battalion's first battle, their first action in the war, and they performed heroically, but the casualties were horrific. During the first day's charge into the woods, the 3rd Battalion and another Marine unit together suffered almost 1,100 killed and wounded, about half their strength. It was the bloodiest single day in the history of the Marine Corps up to that time. Now, the battle was still underway when a young Marine named Foster Stevens arrived with a group of replacement soldiers. He'd been assigned to that 83rd Company, that same 3rd Battalion that had just gotten mauled in the wheat field. And on June 25, just after his arrival, the Marines led a fresh assault against German strongholds in the woods. One of them wrote in his diary that night about how they all clung to their foxholes or any hole or crater they could find as German artillery raked the woods all night. The most feared shells were the ones they called the whiz-bangs. This is what the diarist wrote. You could hear the whistle of their coming, and then they go off a split second later. That's the only warning you got. And yet the next day, the Marines advanced again, and that evening, the commanding officer sent a message to headquarters that read, "Woods now U.S. Marine Corps entirely." Now, this battle became an instant legend, and it remains today among the Marine Corps' most celebrated victories of all time. It was said that the Marines were so fierce in battle that the Germans began calling them Teufelhunden, which means devil dogs, and the name stuck. To this day, the Marine Corps' 3rd Battalion, 6th Regiment calls itself Devil Dogs because of this battle. A few weeks later, the same battalion was sent across open fields again to attack heavy German fortifications at the French city of Soissons. It was another bloody epic, but the battle succeeded in halting Germany's last great offensive of the war. With little time to rest, they saw action at Saint-Mihiel and Mont Blanc. And then finally, in September, Allied commanders planned a massive assault that would unleash waves of American troops, 1.2 million in all, against the German lines in a bold attempt to drive the occupiers out and end the war. The battle would be known to history as the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. As I said, it was the largest American military operation in terms of numbers of all time. And Foster and his 83rd Company would again find themselves right in the middle of the action. In early November, after weeks of fighting, the 83rd Company was sent forward to begin the final decisive push against the German lines. From battlefield reports, we know they formed their lines early that morning with orders to attack at dawn and make a 3.5-mile dash uphill to a village called Bayonville and try to take out a German artillery position there. They reached the town of Bayonville, which we're going to see here. There it is, Bayonville, and this is actually, I visited this place, and so that's the hill we're going to talk about. They reached the village of Bayonville with 3 tanks in support, and they attacked the enemy's main artillery batteries. A battalion after-action report describes what happened next. While under cover of the crest of this hill, it was found possible for the 83rd Company with tanks to flank a battery of 4 enemy 77mm guns. One tank approached and covered the advance of a squad of riflemen. They soon compelled the surrender of 1 officer and 77 German artillerymen. Over 200 of the enemy were observed retreating on the run into the woods. Then they went on to capture the town itself in a, quote, systematic and business-like manner with no losses in the company and 100 prisoners taken. Now, there were literally hundreds of battles and skirmishes throughout this day. But the Marines' achievement at Bayonville was so sweeping that it drew the attention of the war correspondents from leading U.S. newspapers at the time. In the center, we smashed through to Bayonville, the New York Times correspondent wrote on November 2nd. Trapped between artillery fire and the charging Marines, the article said, Germans by the hundreds simply turned and surrendered. Now, the attack on Bayonville was actually the very last engagement of the 83rd Company of the war. The Marines, a week later, reached the Meuse River, and they were waiting for instructions to cross it when a messenger came with news that the war was over. But Foster wasn't with them at the end. Sometime on November 2nd, Foster Stevens was killed in combat. A field report describes what's happened. It said that simply that Stevens was killed by a gunshot wound while in the line of duty on November 2nd. Exactly how he was killed was not recorded. What was known, and I saw in the records, was that Foster's body, still in his Marine uniform, was wrapped in burlap, placed in a pine box, and buried on November 3rd in a temporary grave by the battlefield. A Navy telegram was drafted for the family to let them know what happened. Deeply regret to inform you, it began. Message from abroad states Private Foster B. Stevens, Marine Corps, was killed in action on November 2nd. When I studied the telegram, I noticed something really interesting. One detail stood out. It's stamped as delivered on November 30th, 1918. November 30th. Remember, the war ended on November 11th. So 3 weeks before the telegram was delivered, Americans at home learned that the war was over. The armistice had been signed. And the news of the war's end triggered celebrations all across the country because families were learning that their loved ones, their brothers, their husbands, their sons would return home. My own great-grandparents and the rest of the family were surely thrilled by the news of Germany's surrender because it meant that Foster had made it. For 3 weeks, they looked forward to that joyful reunion, and then that joy suddenly turned to sorrow and grief when they got this bad news. It's no wonder my grandmother struggled to talk about this time. Later, the family was asked whether they wanted to have the body returned to the United States. Ultimately, they decided that Foster should remain buried with his comrades in France. A few years after the war, the U.S. government offered a free trip to Europe for any Gold Star mothers and wives who wanted to visit their sons' and husbands' graves. Foster's mom, this is Mary Alice Grantham Stevens, accepted and made the trip in July 1930 on a steamship to France. She's the only one from the family who got to make the trip, and she was able to spend one afternoon in the cemetery with her son before beginning the journey home. But the war's impact extended far and wide, well beyond this one story. This was a sign that was erected in Goldsboro after the war with a list of the names of those killed. Of 86,000 North Carolinians who were sent to France, 2,400 did not return. Some were killed in combat, others died of disease, including the Spanish flu, which became a global pandemic in 1918. 3,600 North Carolinians came home with severe injuries and wounds. And of those hundreds of Wayne County veterans who served, 56 did not return. 37 of the dead were from the Goldsboro Rifles, that 119th Infantry. The Wayne County Veterans Memorial breaks down the numbers. 30 killed in action, 2 from combat injuries, 22 from disease, 20 were African Americans, 1 was a civilian, 1 was a sailor, 1 was a Marine, and a haunting statistic, 5 soldiers from Wayne County were killed on the war's very last day. Not just the last week, the very last day. And in fact, 29 North Carolina soldiers were killed on that very last day. Soldiers from the 81st Division, which is made up mostly of men from North Carolina and other southern states, were sent over the top early that morning, even though the ceasefire agreement had already been reached and the top generals knew that the war was going to end in a few hours. So they were literally killed in the last minutes of the war. But the Americans had fought with distinction, and they'd helped bring the war to an end. And when they returned home in the weeks and months that followed, the country was swept up in a wave of patriotic fervor. Wayne County was caught up in it as well. The next year, in 1919, county leaders authorized the construction of a memorial to honor those who served. In 1925, the Wayne County Memorial Community Building was opened to honor veterans of the Great War. Later, it would become a permanent memorial to Wayne County veterans of all wars. That building was replaced by the Memorial Pavilion in Goldsboro that exists today. For Wayne County residents, like all Southerners, the war redefined what it meant to serve the country. Wiping away the bitterness and the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction, North Carolinians, white and black, had been part of a united all-American armed force that had been victorious in war and brought honor to the country. Now, this was not the war to end all wars, as had been promised. The conflict was sold to Americans as the war that would make the world safe for democracy, and it didn't do that either. As we now know, many of the evils of the next century can be traced back to the war and the flawed peace treaties that followed. Germany was crushed by defeat and by the punishing terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The millions of Americans were easily entranced by a charismatic fascist leader named Adolf Hitler, who blamed the country's defeat on minorities and promised to make Germany great again. World War I crushed Russia's Tsarist army and set the stage for communist revolution. Russia became the Soviet Union, and 70 years of Cold War followed. This is close to my subject area. The victorious Western powers carved up Turkey's Ottoman Empire, which had fallen on the side of Germany. The Ottomans ruled almost the entire Middle East and governed it as a caliphate for centuries. The French and British leaders split up the territory between them and drew boundaries that made no sense and created countries that had never existed before. And that set the stage for a century of violence and conflict that followed. The terrorist group ISIS, something I'm very familiar with, took over parts of Syria and Iraq in 2014, in part to erase the boundaries that those colonial powers had drawn at the end of World War I. For the United States, though, this was a triumphant moment that solidifies America's place as one of the world's great economic, industrial, and military powers. Building on the technical innovations made in the war, Americans made enormous strides in health and medicine and communication, transportation, education, all of it resulting in improved living standards here at home. An expanding military helped create prosperity here in Wayne County. 23 years after the war, Seymour Johnson Air Force Base was established. The county doubled in size between the end of the Great War and the 1960s. And despite their loss, the Stevens family thrived as well. Ina Stevens lived to be 100 years old. In addition to her 4 children, she had 9 grandchildren, several of them are being here tonight. She had 12 great-grandchildren, and throughout her life, that portrait of her brother was proudly displayed in her living room as a reminder of the loss and sacrifice, as well as the abiding love between siblings. And eventually, as I said, the portrait ended up coming to me, and inspired me to write an article that ran in the Washington Post in 1918. And to my surprise, the article was picked up by other publications and reprinted by others, and I got a tsunami of emails and comments from all around the country, with many people reaching out to share their own stories. And I felt some satisfaction, believing I had done as much as I could to bring attention and new insight, not just to Foster's story, but to the service of millions of other Americans in a mostly forgotten war. I was not able to answer all the questions about Foster's last battle, but I accepted that some things are just unknowable, lost to time, or so I thought. Then came the email that blew me away. It turns out that answers did exist, and we learned them literally from a voice from the grave. In 2019, a year after the first article was published, I received an email from an Ohio man who had seen my article and connected with it in a unique way. The man's name was Byron Scarborough. This is what he wrote to me. He said, "I saw the article in the Washington Post about your great-uncle, Private Foster Stevens. That's a name I've known for a very long time. My grandfather was Private James Scarborough, 83rd Company, 3rd Battalion. He considered Foster one of his very best friends. Please see the attached photo of my grandfather standing at Foster's grave during one of our visits in the 1980s. The writer possessed some astonishing details. His grandfather, this is him, Jim Scarborough, was not only friends with Foster, but happened to be with him when he was killed. He had witnessed his friend's death, and he had talked about it years later with his family. Incredibly, those memories had been preserved, and in fact, they had been recorded on tape. Those tapes existed decades after Jim Scarborough finally died in the late 1980s. So all these years later, when Byron saw my article, he remembered the name Foster Stevens and the stories his grandfather had told. And now that grandson was reaching out to a stranger on the other side of the country to tell a story about Foster Stevens that my family had never heard. Now, who was this Ohio private? Jim Scarborough was from Tennessee and had been a factory worker in Ohio when he joined the Marines. Like Foster, he was assigned to the 83rd Company. They'd fought at Belleau Wood together, and Jim and Foster ended up being in the same rifle squad. Through 5 months of combat, they went from being squad mates and comrades to best friends. Scarborough was traumatized by his experiences in the war, but he survived. And after coming home, his family encouraged him to share his memories. And with some prodding, he did just that. Then someone thought to put a tape recorder in front of him as he talked. Here's a snippet of Private Scarborough as an old man for a few seconds just talking about the Battle of Belleau Wood.
Oh, heck, I guess we had to crawl at least 150, 200 yards up this ditch to get up to where these machine guns were. And evidently some of the Germans must have saw our backs. We was crawling in this ditch just about as close as a man could crawl. Them bullets was digging into the opposite side of the ditch, and we stopped there while this bullets was digging in there, and Major Sibley said to me, he says, that lieutenant was wrong. He says, he didn't know what he was talking about. He said, there's more machine guns up there than we have men right here.
There are hours and hours of these tapes of literally a voice in the grave talking about his experiences from that time. One of the stories that the old private told was of meeting Foster Stevens during those first few weeks of war. The two discovered they had much in common. We were both from the Mid-South, both had big families we were far from, both fiercely independent, Jim Scarborough said. We both liked to hunt and fish. We were like two peas in a pod. It was only a short time before I considered Foster my best friend and I his. He remembered some lighthearted moments. Once the two friends got into trouble, Foster and Jim, for trying to shoot an owl and then cook it. Another time they tossed grenades into a pond to catch fish. There's a theme here, obviously, these guys were hungry. But there was a painful memory that Jim Scarborough never talked about until one day in 1985 when the old veteran went on a trip to France with his family to tour some of those old battlefields where he had served. And as they strolled through the Moose-Argonne Cemetery, Jim Scarborough told his friend he needed to look for the grave of his old buddy, Foster Stevens. And that night, he talked about how the war ended for Foster. "I've never talked about this, well, ever," he said. Here's what he said. "We began to take a shelling," he said. "I hollered for my boys to get their heads down, and I looked across our spread, and just then one shell came in shorter than the others and landed right amongst us. I grabbed to hold on to the earth as it shook us pretty hard. When I got up, I saw the saddest thing I saw for the entire war. The shell had come in and barreled up the dirt right where my old foxhole was, right where I had been 2 minutes earlier. And there was Foster, thrown up and back like a rag doll. His limbs were laying all wrong, and I scrambled over to him, and I knew with every step that it was no use. I could hear the lieutenant's whistle, and I heard him holler to move out. I lifted Foster's limp neck and supported his head like he could feel something. Foster had been struck with a piece of shrapnel that killed him instantly. The artillery was still rolling in on us, and I was as grieved and shocked as a man could be. Flat out," Scarborough said, "I was scared. Foster and I had stuck together as much as possible. We were as close as can be. Every engagement, I knew somebody was looking out for me, and he knew that I was looking out for him." Scarborough's unit was still on the attack, so he had to leave his friend behind. But later, after the battle, his thoughts returned to Foster. Here's how he described the moment. "First chance I got, I found a shovel and went back to the kickoff point. In the darkness, I found Foster's body and scooped him up. I sat there with him all night, trying to find the words, not knowing what to say, as if he could hear me. It was the longest night of the war for me. When the sky started to get light, I could see dawn was coming. I dug him a grave, stepped down into it, and laid my friend there. Throwing that first shovel of dirt on him hurt me more than throwing dirt on my own father's face." Scarborough was never able to share those memories with Foster's loved ones, but he preserved them, entrusting the story with his family. And in doing that, he enabled his grandson to speak for him nearly a century after Foster's death, to let us know what happened and to let us know that somebody was with him in those moments, someone who cared for him. His grandson Byron, in telling the story to me, described it as paying a debt, an unspoken obligation between two comrades and good friends who developed that deep friendship in battle in places thousands of miles from their home. He felt it was very important to relay this story to me, Byron Scarborough told me. Foster was my grandfather's best friend. My grandfather was my best friend. And we both had the same rules. So it's important for me to tell this story to Foster's family. Friendship, he said, is a thing that transcends time. I hope you enjoyed this story, and I hope it inspires you to reflect the next time you see the photo of the veteran in your house. If you know a veteran, I hope you'll take a moment during Veterans Day next week to say thank you. I mentioned near the opening an American military cemetery called Flanders Fields, the one I visited in college by mistake before learning I was in the wrong place. The name is associated with a famous poem written by a Canadian soldier in 1915 after a memorial service for one of his friends who had been killed in battle. The poet, whose name was John McCrae, died in 1918, the same year as Foster. And I'll leave you with a few lines from this poem called In Flanders Fields. In Flanders Field the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Field. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you, from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Field. Thanks very much. I'd be happy to take a few questions if anybody has any. Can be about the research, about the war, other topics, Middle East, whatever is on your mind.
Before a question, Joby,
Hey.
I want to thank you for being here, and I'm telling you, it bring tears to an old man's eyes almost. My question to you is, how soon are you going to write this the movie script for this whole thing that you presented?
You know, from a selfish point of view, I think this is such a great story that you could imagine how it would be portrayed. I'm up to my eyeballs in a book I'm trying to get out right now, but I'm thinking about it because I feel like this is a moment that was so important in American history that, I mean, who thinks about World War I now or what it meant? But it was actually a really big deal, and it was a big deal for communities like this that had never been involved in anything this expansive and this important, and yet they volunteered or were drafted, and they all went overseas to serve, not knowing what they were going to face, not being prepared at all for what they were going to find over there. Many of them didn't come back home, many of them did, and it changed us. And I feel like to tell the story, and sometimes is our little trick or gimmick as writers, is if you want to tell a big story, sometimes it's important to focus on the little story about real people and have you follow their progress through this adventure, and at the end, people come away understanding kind of what really happened. And if there's a way to tell that, I'm waiting for the call from Hollywood, but yeah, I feel like there is hopefully a story I could tell in a bigger way sometime.
And I'll just make another comment here. You have grand folks on the Stevens and the Warrick clan. I think you and I share a Warrick common ancestor way back 5 generations ago. That common ancestor was named Joby Warrick. Mm-hmm. Joby Warrick had 6 sons in the Civil War at the same time. Yeah. 3 in Alabama units and 3 in North Carolina units. Yeah. Just wanted to.
Yes.
And your grandpa, Dr. L.A. Warrick, was one of the most thought of citizens in Wayne County all of his life.
Thank you for that. It was a great honor to grow up, even though I missed meeting Joby Warrick by about 6 months. My mom was pregnant when he passed away in March 1960. But he's been a hero to me, and I know it means a lot to me when I'm out in this part of the county and people still remember Dr. Warrick. I know that takes some older folks in the community still remember this, but he was a remarkable man. And Joby Warrick, I mean, this is the way it was back in those days. Joby Warrick had 17 children, 3 of them, 3 different wives who happened to be sisters. So one sister passed away, then he married the other one, then he married the other one, and had a pile of kids, 17 of them. We don't think he could read or write because his will documents are signed with an X, which is usually a giveaway the person couldn't write their own name. But he owned property, and he obviously had a pretty successful, crazy life. I mean, the further you get into sort of the ancestral records and stories, you find some really crazy, surprising things. There's a murder that takes place within the family with a father killing a son over a drunken argument. There's some wacky things, but they're family. That's our blood, so you kind of have to own up to it. Thanks for the question.
I just have a couple of statements. First of all, from a history teacher standpoint, thank you for this story. For the local connection, it makes it even more special and better. Would like to just piggyback on one thing. Wayne County is special as far as its veterans go and its contributions to all wars. North Carolina also has a higher percentage of soldiers that have participated in our U.S. military, either volunteering or being drafted, percentage-wise compared to a lot of states. But also, you go back towards the end of World War I or the Great War, if it had not been for the Americans and over 50,000 a month going overseas to fight with the Allies, the war could have turned out different.
Yeah.
And who knows how history would be rewritten. But also interesting too, the 6 weeks. These young men who went to boot camp, they only trained for 6 weeks.
Yeah.
That's not a whole lot of training to go meet what they were going to go meet. And then as far as another Grantham World War II veteran who certainly deserves more study, that would be the life of military service of Billy Hood.
Oh, yeah.
His story is also just hard to fathom and hard to comprehend at times. Yeah. But thank you for what you do, and it's been a blessing to my wife and I both for being here today.
I love those comments, and you're right. This is absolutely a place where military service means so much in every family. That's the reason I asked that question at the beginning, because I doubt there are many houses in all of Goldsboro or all of Wayne County that don't have at least one veteran who's remembered on a photograph. And that's just kind of part of our culture and part of who we were. And I do think it's interesting, this moment in World War I where we make this transition from kind of being, putting the Civil War behind us and uniting as Americans to join something as big as that. You're right about the quick training. I feel like I've memorized Foster's records. He volunteers in February, has to go up to Norfolk for that, goes to Paris Island for about 6 weeks of training. Next thing you know, in April, he's on a boat on his way to Europe, and then he's getting slung into a battle that's raging as he gets there, and somehow survives to the very end before he's killed. Thanks for the comment.
My great uncle was one of those that died on the last day of the war.
Wow.
And he is the M. Williams on the memorial.
Very good.
That you showed. And I, like you, wound up with the portraits and everything at my house.
Yeah.
So it was
That-
something we talked about a lot.
Yeah. That last day thing is just haunting to me. And I must say, when I was beginning this journey, I was thinking my uncle, wow, 9 days, he almost made it. Can you imagine the families of the ones who lost loved ones on the very last day? And it became a bit of a scandal, because when these troops came home and the war was over, the Congress called General Pershing, the American commander, into Congress for questioning. He said, why did you let these soldiers, you knew the war was over, why did you order them into combat that soon before the war was over? And the answer, it's all kind of like, well, we didn't know that the Germans would honor the armistice. We wanted to try to get the best advantageous positions on the battlefield, which meant crossing the rivers and having certain strongholds and high grounds. And so they thought it was worth their expenditure of lives and sacrifice to send soldiers over the top, knowing that the war was going to end in hours. But I think that's probably small comfort to families that almost got their loved ones back, but just didn't. So it's really, you honor their sacrifice, but you also have to, wow, that was almost made it and didn't. Thank you.
First off, I envy you. My grandfather fought for Germany in World War I, and I knew him as a young man, but we only talked about the war one time. I know hardly anything about what he did. When I taught, I used to talk about World War I as the great dividing line of civilization. Before World War I, nationalism, industry, science, patriotism were all good. But because of World War I, an entire generation was slaughtered for no good reason.
Yeah.
And when we look back on World War I now, it's like, oh yeah, it came before World War II, and yeah, Germany started it. You have a sense of how significant it was.
Yeah.
Do you think people, the general public, will ever gain an understanding of how essential understanding World War I is to understanding the history of mankind?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not just the American history, because like I say, we were latecomers. And the experience and sort of the takeaway for these countries that fought in this war was utter despair. Because you're right, there was a moment, the turn of the century, where all these new inventions and new technologies, and we were kind of, felt like anything was possible. There's affluence in Europe and in America, and it was a moment of relative tranquility. You had these big competitions, the Germans and the French and the Russians, they all hated each other and were scheming constantly, but that's what the kings and prime ministers was doing, and not us. After that war happened, and so many people killed, again, 4% of the entire population in some of the countries involved, even more for Russia. And after that was over, it's like, man, mankind is lost. We're self-destructive. We take our technology and we use it to slaughter each other. Every interesting invention that we could come up with was somehow transported into a way to kill people. I spent a lot of time in my career, because I work on issues related to weapons of mass destruction. Chemical warfare was invented in the trenches of World War I because we've gotten too good at stopping assaults with machine guns and that kind of thing. So why not lob chlorine and then mustard gas and then all these other nasty things in clouds that would just waft over a trench and kill everybody that was there? In the beginning, there was really no way to defend yourself. It was later on that people came up with gas masks, which were only of limited effectiveness. Some soldiers figured out the best thing to do was sort of the compounds, I guess it's ammonia in urine, so neutralizes some of the gases. And so they would put urine on a cloth and put that over their face, because that would block out some of the toxins, but not 100%. I had that one picture of a whole bunch of soldiers kind of lined up with their hands on the other's backs. They were victims of a chemical weapons attack. After the war was over, this is one thing that the whole world recoiled at this, killing soldiers like bugs with chemical sprays, that they decided to outlaw that entire class of weapons. So it was the first time in history that the entire class of weapons was banned. And that happened in the 1920s because everybody was so horrified at what happened. But then we went on to find other things. By World War II, it was biological weapons. Thank God that never happened on a big scale. But our country, the Russians, the Brits, were stockpiling weapons that were based on anthrax, were based on plague virus, all kinds of things, just new ways to kill people. After a nuclear exchange, they were going to lob missiles with smallpox, the pathogens, just to kill any people that were left. The inventiveness, on one hand, is impressive, but also just horrifying, realizing this is our race, this is who we are, that there's a brutality that exists at a certain level, that we're willing to use these kinds of weapons to kill one another. Just really remarkable stuff. Thanks for the question.
I know when I was in the Air Force, they took us one day and made pictures. The picture but it's nothing like the size of the picture that you have of Foster. Was that a common thing? I mean, obviously he didn't go home once he left.
Yeah.
I know how big that picture is because I've seen it. Was that common for every soldier to have a big picture or portrait like that?
So not everybody. When you guys first came in, you saw a bunch of photos of World War I veterans on a loop. They were all North Carolina soldiers, and I found them on different websites and just compiled them. So a lot of soldiers had portraits. The one of Foster, the one I showed in the beginning, was unusual. And it's hard to tell it's photo-like, but there's obviously, it's like photoshopped or something, whatever they had in the day. They embellished it with some paintbrush. You can see that it's been altered a bit. But I think it was because this was a family grappling with the grief of the loss of their loved one, and they wanted to memorialize him. And so I think there were services around, artists who would do this for you, would take the photograph and then create something like this. What's interesting about it, there's some very oddities as I studied it so much that I began to notice. One was like you could see his regimental details, 83rd Company. There's one little thing, a button that says that. That was my first clue about where he served. But you also notice that he's called on the portrait Sergeant Foster Stevens. I've never seen a record anywhere else that he was actually promoted from private, so that was a surprise. Another one is, it's a funny thing to even mention, but we've talked all our lives about him being killed on November 2nd. I'm pretty sure it was November 1st, because that was when the battle kicked off. According to his friend who was with him, he was killed in the opening artillery salvo before they charged. That would have been November 1st, not November 2nd. There was really no fighting on November 2nd. So I think it was just, a historical inaccuracy that doesn't mean anything, ultimately, but it's just lots of curious things went into the memorializing of these soldiers after they came home or didn't come home. Question? No cat calls in the back.
I was just wondering about your, how you feel about our future after all the things you've studied, the nuclear, the biologic, and Middle East, all of the tensions. What is your outlook?
That's a good question. I hope everybody can hear the questions as they're coming. So that one was basically, after studying these things and with the work I do with my day job, how do I feel about the future with these weapons? That's a very good question. It's actually something I'm thinking about quite a lot lately, because a lot of my career was not just studying things like terrorism, but weapons proliferation. So I really got deeply into nuclear weapons and biological and chemical weapons. And after the Cold War, we went from this moment of like having two countries armed with nuclear weapons to the teeth and ready to destroy each other. Went from that moment to this moment where it almost seemed hopeful for a moment, because the Russian leaders, Yeltsin and Bush at the time, talked about, well, let's reduce our stockpiles. Let's figure out ways to make this less dangerous. Let's make it less of a hair trigger situation. And lots of weapons were actually eliminated. And American delegations went over to the former Soviet Union after it collapsed and oversaw the destruction of missiles, oversaw the destruction of huge stockpiles of chemical weapons. All kinds of progress was made. That progress is very much in the rearview window now, because we're once again arming ourselves very quickly, and the Chinese are part of it. So you've got this now, instead of a Russia versus US competition, it's a three-way competition with the Chinese that feel compelled for some reason to try to build as many nukes as we have. And that's never been the case. They always had kind of a defensive posture with their nuclear arms, but now they're racing to make more. What worries me more than that, to be honest, is new technology, AI, and what that means for chemical and biological weapons. It's not that easy to make a sophisticated biological weapon. It's not easy to make one that will overwhelm your sort of natural defenses or the vaccines you have. We have vaccines against anthrax and smallpox. With AI, you can use machines to tweak the DNA, to tweak the biological formulas of these weapons to make them much more dangerous, much more difficult to detect if they've been used. And the same goes with chemical weapons. There's like millions of combinations of things like sarin, if you know what that is one of the deadliest substances ever made, and the British and the Americans, the Russians all invented this. It's one of these chemicals that's so deadly that just a few drops on your skin will kill you. I mean, it's the most lethal stuff ever made. And now you've got, with machine learning, you can find ways to make it either more lethal or make it more easy to make, get around sort of conventions and safeguards that are supposed to prevent people from doing these things. Back when Al-Qaeda attacked New York in 2001, those of us covering terrorism worried a lot about Al-Qaeda using anthrax. And sure enough, in 2001, we had an anthrax attack in the United States. Now it's so much easier for somebody in a remote place without a lot of equipment to make things that are truly nasty. And why they haven't done it yet is just a puzzle, because it's easier now than ever. And if you want to maybe not kill a lot of people, but want to destroy a country's economy, there are agricultural diseases, crop diseases, livestock diseases that are very easy to transmit and spread. You can put some on a petri dish and carry it to a pasture, and the next thing you know, you've got thousands of heads of cattle infected with disease, and they'll have to be slaughtered or quarantined, and you can sink agricultural economies fairly quickly. So not meaning to be scary here at the end, but there's a lot that's out there that's threatening, and there's a lot that we're not thinking about as deeply as we should, because the moment, that window when we were thinking about things like defending ourselves against anthrax and chemical weapons, that's pretty much gone. Those programs are being either shut down, or they're just, they're not being actively pursued. But the bad guys, we know, are interested, because we see it in their messaging. We know they want chemical and biological weapons, and that's the threat that kind of keeps me up at night, is something that we're not anticipating right now. Thanks, John. And I know we're getting late, but happy to do a few more. So I know some of you guys want to head home and get some dinner, but anybody else want to? We got up here.
This will seem a little off the subject, but Goldsboro has kind of a hero from World War I himself. His name, help me out with him, Brodie West. Anybody ever heard the name Brodie or Brodie West? Captured 30 Germans single-handedly during World War I.
Yeah, it's almost like
read about it.
Like an Augie Murphy situation. Yeah, it's really extraordinary. And the one thing I feel bad about in telling the story of Foster is that, as heroic as he was, in the sense that he was involved in all these battles, he was not alone. And again, my intent in telling his story is to help us think about all these others, including Brodie. And there were some real heroes who fought in that war that were right from here, from our hometowns. Well, I enjoyed this. I appreciate all you coming out on a Monday night. It's been good to spend some time with you. And if you have a question you didn't want to ask while we were in a group, if you want to come up after, I'll be here for a few minutes and happy to chat with anybody who wants to talk. Thanks again. Good to see you all. Take care.